Good afternoon. My name is Thomas Caldwell and I'm the programmer for the Melbourne International Film Festival. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're gathered on the traditional land of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Welcome to Beyond Buoyancy, International Slavery and Our Seafood, a MIFF Talks event. This year the MIFF Talks program is presented by the University of Melbourne, Faculty of Fine Arts and Music. For information on other events, please visit miff.com.au/talks. And don't forget that the film Buoyancy, which had its Australian premiere at MIFF last night, has 2 more screenings at the festival on the 12th and 15th of August. Tickets for those 2 screenings can be booked at miff.com.au. Now, our moderator today is Lisa Cox, an investigative journalist and Guardian Australia's environmental reporter. She has covered environmental issues and policy for several years and was previously a political reporter for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. She also works in television drama and was one of the co-creators of the Easy Tiger SBS miniseries Sunshine. I'm now really pleased to be able to hand you over to Lisa. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Welcome, everybody. I'm just going to start by introducing our panellists today. So at the end of the table, we've got Prum Vannak. Vannak is an artist and survivor of human trafficking. He's currently on the Australian book tour of his graphic memoir, The Deadeye and the Deep Blue Sea, which is, if you've noticed on your way in, for sale at the back of the venue today. He wrote and drew for this novel about his experience of being sold into a Thai fishing fleet and into Malaysia. And he's currently collaborating on an adaptation of the book into an animated feature film and uses his art to fight modern slavery. Next, we've got Mora Gibbings, who is the welfare coordinator at the Cambodian Association of Victoria. She was born in Cambodia and is a survivor of the Pol Pot regime. She's worked extensively in the non-profit and education sector and led a team for the International Organisation for Migration in Cambodia that was assessing how to prevent trafficking of women and children. And just a note, Mora will also be translating from Cambodian for Vannak today. Next, we've got Next up, we've got Kate Skattang. She's a supply chain expert. She's a supply chain consultant and a lecturer at the University of Melbourne on supply chain strategy. Kate also writes a blog called The Ethical Warrior, which brings together stories about these issues. We then have Rathjen, who's an Australian writer and director and was indeed the writer and director of the film Buoyancy. It's his first feature film and he spent a significant amount of time in both Thailand and Cambodia researching the issues at the heart of it. And finally, next to me is Dr. David Cooke, who is the chair and managing director of Konica Minolta, a global Japanese technology company. He's also the chair of the UN Global Compact Network Australia, which promotes the UN Sustainable Development Goals to business. Thanks everybody for coming along today. Rod, I might actually start with you, being the director of the film. You're an Australian writer and director. You're raised in country Victoria. How was it that you came to create a film about slavery and exploitation in Southeast Asia's fishing industry?
I read an article from the Environmental Justice Foundation many years ago and couldn't quite believe what I was reading about. There was some survivor stories within that report, and so I started doing a little bit more research and felt guilty that I didn't know more about the Thai fishing industry, and it's happening so close to Australia, and in this day and age the kind of stories were so inhumane and horrendous, and it was kind of quite shocking. So from there, I kind of thought a great way to kind of bring their voice to the world would be through a film. So through an elaborate research process and consultation, framed a narrative around a lot of the interviews of survivors, and and we made a film about it.
Just in terms of that research process, I'm interested to hear a bit more about that, because you obviously said that, you know, when you read these articles for the first time, you were shocked that you didn't know more about it. You know, this is an industry that operates somewhat with secrecy as its business model. So how were you able to, I guess, penetrate that and, you know, conduct the necessary interviews that you needed to do to create this film?
I was working with a lot of NGOs in Thailand and Cambodia, and it just, whilst I was researching, it happened to coincide with the survivors that were found on Benjina in Indonesia. And so a lot of those survivors were being repatriated back through NGOs in Thailand and Cambodia. And so I arranged with those NGOs to interview these survivors and, you know, talk to them.
What was that like?
Sad, yeah, overwhelming. It's kind of hard to imagine the stories that they, or their lives that they've experienced. So yeah, it was incredibly devastating, and yeah.
Kate, I might just throw over to you here. We're talking about issues of modern slavery today and things like a supply chain. These are terms that perhaps a lot of people haven't necessarily even heard before. Could you, just through your line of work, could you explain what each of those things means and what it is exactly when people talk about modern slavery and keeping an eye on supply chains of products?
Yeah, so I think it's hard for audiences when they view a movie like what the movie that Rod's made, when they can see how these things happen and what it looks like, but they don't quite understand how that translates then to the fish and the products that you buy in the supermarket. And so, you know, it's through the work that I've done at Melbourne University and some of the research work that we did, we actually traced the seafood, or the tuna, supply chain. So we interviewed more than 40 different individuals from brands in Australia, from supermarkets in Australia, for processors in Thailand, NGOs in Thailand, and through and some survivors as well. And you know, I guess that's how it comes to be on the supermarket shelf, is that, you know, the problem is not the problem is not even really visible to the supermarket. You know, it's the supermarket supplier where this sort of problem happens. And at the end of last year, Australia implemented legislation that has now made organisations that have a turnover of more than $100 million map all of those companies that form part of that chain of supply, and to identify what the risks are within that supply chain, and to be more transparent about that, not just to government but to consumers as well.
Great, thank you. I might come back to a few more questions about that legislation later on. Vannak, I would like to ask you a question, if you're comfortable talking about this. You're a survivor of human trafficking yourself. Could you tell us a bit about what happened to you?
Prum Vannak, oh, sorry. sorry. I am Prum Vannak. I come from Cambodia, so I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion. Sorry. Because the way how I escaped from the trafficking, actually I was swimming out from the fishing boat, and he swam to Malaysian island.
តែដូចថាខ្ញុំទៅដល់កោះម៉ាឡេហ្នឹងវាដូចថាខ្ញុំរត់ទៅរកប៉ូលីសដើម្បីឲ្យប៉ូលីសជួយដល់ពេលចុងក្រោយប៉ូលីសហ្នឹងយកទៅលោកដូចថាឲ្យធ្វើការចំការដងប្រេងបាទបន្ថែមទៀតបាទ
So when I arrived Malaysian, actually I seeking for the police help from the Malaysian police, but actually I've been sold again to work in the oil plantation in Malaysia.
ហើយក្រោយមកខ្ញុំទំនាក់ទំនងមកដល់អង្គការលីកាដូខលដូចថាមកប្រទេសខ្មែរនឹងដើម្បីថាមកអង្គការលីកាដូដើម្បីឲ្យដូចថាឲ្យគាត់ជួយដូចថាដើម្បីជួយខ្ញុំត្រឡប់មកប្រទេសកម្ពុជាវិញ
So when I was in Malaysia, I actually contact the human rights organization in Cambodia called Likado in order for them to seek support from the Likado from Cambodia.
ប៉ុន្តែខ្ញុំនិយាយកាត់ទេវាថាសាច់រឿងរបស់ខ្ញុំដូចតែនៅក្នុងសភៅនេះបើថាចង់ដឹងមានតែនៅក្នុងសភៅបាទខ្ញុំនិយាយកាត់
Okay, so also I have the story about how I survived from the fishing boat in this book.
Vannak, how long were you on the fishing boat for?
លើទូកនឹងធ្វើការលើទូកនឹងឆ្នាំ
ខ្ញុំធ្វើការលើទូកវា3ឆ្នាំ7ខែ
So I was working in the fishing boat for 3 years and 7 months.
Wow.
សរុបទាំងអស់វាទាំងនៅប្រទេសម៉ាឡេហ្នឹងវាទាំងជាប់គុកទាំងអីទាំងអស់វាចូល5ឆ្នាំ
So together when I was living in the fishing boat and also I was in the prison in Malaysia is 5 years.
I think also Vannak didn't see land for that period of time as well. Is that correct?
ពេល5ឆ្នាំអត់ដែរឡើងមកលើគោកឯក្នុងទឹករហូតដល់
3ឆ្នាំជាងអត់ដូចថានៅកណ្ដាលសមុទ្រ
So 3 years and 7 months is always inside the boat. He never see the land.
Can you tell us a bit about the conditions on the boat and what would happen to people on the boat?
ឥឡូវនិយាយប្រាប់គេរឿងទៅពេលមកណាឯងនៅក្នុងកណូតហ្នឹងហើយពួកម៉ាក់ឯងនៅក្នុងកណូតត្រីហ្នឹងណា
បើខ្ញុំចង់និយាយថាខ្លីៗដូចថាពីបញ្ហាការដែលធ្វើការនៅកណ្ដាលសមុទ្រហ្នឹងវាមានការជួបលំបាកនឹងការថាឧបសគ្គខ្លាំងទីបំផុតដូចថាគ្រោះថ្នាក់វាមានដូចថាការកាប់សម្លាប់គ្នាហើយធ្វើបាបពីថៅកែមេដូចថាហួរណាដែលដូចថាអ្នកដែលត្រួតការនៅលើទូកហ្នឹងបាទ
I can describe only for short a little bit about how suffering and scary while I was living in the fishing boat because it could be fighting, killing, and abusing. It's a lot of things that is very hard to describe.
David, you're in the corporate world and you've taken a significant personal interest in issues like this. Konica Minolta has been involved in advocacy work to try to end precisely the sort of practices that Vannak has just been telling us about. Can you tell us a bit about the sort of work you've been doing?
Okay, thank you. Can I firstly just acknowledge and thank Vannak for his incredible courage that he has shown throughout his life and being here today. And for that matter, thank the others on the panel too for the work they're doing to end slavery. So the connection point for Konica Minolta, there were two main connection points with modern slavery. The first was about 6 years ago. I'd just been made the managing director of the company, and perhaps to my eternal shame, I didn't really know that slavery existed. I kind of thought it was an historical thing that had been pretty much eradicated probably 150 years ago. But we had a conference in Cambodia and we needed a keynote speaker for our gala dinner night, you know, where we give out awards, all that corporate kind of stuff. And I didn't really know who to get, and somebody recommended a woman called Somali Mam to me who'd been rescuing young women from sexual slavery for something like 20 years. So she spoke, and she brought about half a dozen young women with her who were survivors of sexual slavery. And I've got to say I was deeply moved by meeting these young people. And our company then began to provide some financial sponsorship and, you know, so that these young women could go through university, and they've come out the other end now One's a nurse, two are psychologists. The psychologists have gone on to doing master's degrees now. Two are accountants, what have you. So we made a connection point there. But then I started to research the whole concept of slavery, and I realised that business, big business in fact, was very implicit with the whole issue of slavery, very, very much intertwined. It's all about money. It's all about profits, earned illegally, and ironically, it's like slavery just pursued us. And 2 years later, we had another conference, and it was in Thailand, and we spent an evening on a tall-masted clipper ship, and on that ship at night out in the ocean, it's just completely pitch black, except we could see these dotted lights all around the ship. And we said to the cruise director, what are all those lights out there? And she said, they're Thai fishing vessels. They shine a light into the water, and that attracts the fish, and that's how they catch them. And she said, interestingly, we recently went over to one of the vessels during the day, just in a little dinghy, and she said, it was the cruise director before her, they rotate week about, so it's the week before, went over and said to the captain of the Thai fishing vessel, could I come on board? I'm from that tourist ship, and I just want to get a better understanding of the type of fish you catch and all that kind of stuff. And he said, yeah, sure, come on board. When she stepped onto that vessel, the first thing she saw was a man on the deck of the boat with a collar around his neck, a chain was attached to it, and he was chained to the deck of the boat. And she said, who's that? And the Thai fishing captain looked and he said, it's a slave. So notice the dehumanising language. Not he's a slave, it's a slave. And she said, but you can't have slaves. And with a sweep of his arm pointing to all the other fishing vessels around, he said, most of us have slaves. And she said, but why have you got him chained up? And the captain said, because this one is a real troublemaker, but not for much longer. It'll be fish food soon. So they were going to kill him. They were going to throw him overboard at sea. Anyway, he said, if you're so concerned about it, you can buy it off me if you want to. They negotiated a price. She went back to the ship, got some money, came back, and she bought that human being for $700 US, which is actually very expensive for a slave, because some research would suggest the average cost of buying a slave these days is about 90 US. That's how appalling the value of life has become to some people. But that cruise ship then pulled into a port, and they took him to a police station where either he was freed and he's now back in Myanmar and having a happy life, or after the ship sailed again, he was resold by the police. We don't know. But after Cooke had those two experiences, we felt that we had to provide whatever resources we could to try and do something about this horrific situation that many people are trapped in.
David, I'm interested to know, because you obviously took something of a role in submissions in relation to the Modern Slavery Act, which came into effect this year. Cooke took a position where it was favouring additional legislation. That's not necessarily the point of view that would be considered typical of businesses necessarily. Can you tell us a bit about what being involved in that process was like, and were there other corporations in the same position where they had the same level of insight that you did in terms of contributing to that process, or was it a bit of a battle to get people to take notice of this issue and do something about it here in Australia?
So for a couple, 18 months, 2 years before the Modern Slavery Act came in, 1st of January this year, we were very strong public advocates for an act, and I went to Canberra probably half a dozen occasions, spoke to DFAT and Attorney Generals and Home Affairs and so on, advocating for an act. And they found it a bit humorous, actually, because they said, well, we're kind of getting civil society coming down and saying business is bad and there's got to be more legislation on them. And we're having business lobby groups coming down and saying there's too much red tape and too much legislation on business, and there shouldn't be any more, and business can self-regulate. And there I was, a business person, in fact, a CEO and a chair, and I was kind of in the camp that, I didn't say business is bad, because I don't think it is necessarily, but I believed that there needed to be more legislation. And when people said to me, the argument is that business can self-regulate, I would simply ask a question back, which is, self-regulation, how do you think that's going? And normally the response would be, what do you mean? And I'd say, well, We know from Gallup research that there's over 40 million people enslaved in the world today. So there are more slaves in the world today than at any point in human history. We also know, if that figure is more than 40 million, that there are more slaves in the world today than were shipped out of Africa in the 400 years leading up to the abolition of slavery in the British Parliament in the 1850s. So how do you reckon this self-regulation thing's going? Is it working out? It was just a no-brainer. And it would be lovely to think that business would not have to be forced into doing the right thing and inspecting its supply chain, but it wasn't doing it. And so the blunt instrument of legislation was required, and that's why we absolutely advocated for it.
Thanks, David. I'm going to come back to Mora. Mora, you've worked extensively on trafficking issues as well, but particularly with women and children. Can you tell us a bit about your experience and perhaps how the stories of the women and girls that you've worked with differ to what we've seen in the film Buoyancy overnight?
So before I talk about it, I just want to say that I involved with the trafficking program in Cambodia. So I like to tell actually there are the 6 trends or kind of trafficking. So one trend like they trafficking the man and the boy working in the fishing boat and related industry. That the one trend, and the second trend, trafficking the woman and the girl, exploitation like sex, become a sex worker. And the third one, the trafficking the child domestic work. Actually, the children that people would come from the countryside and work for people house and never get paid. Or that one of the trend of trafficking. And the fourth one, the trafficking of domestic work that cross the border overseas, like they go to Malaysia, and a lot of women also get trafficking, go to that kind of business. And the number 5, they trafficking the people become a baker like often they take these people that live in the province along, like the Vietnam or Cambodia. They take all this that mixed age, old or young women or men and children just become a baker. When they bake a lot of money, you have like a gangster collect the money from them. And another one they call trafficking by marriage, because now a lot of Chinese that go to Cambodia. So this kind of trafficking, they go through like the tourist visa. So a lot of young Cambodian that have a tourist visa to visit in China. And when they arrive there, they get married and they never come home. Yeah.
So you're working in Cambodia with women and children. What did that involve, and what sorts of stories did that bring you into contact with out of those groups that you've just spoken about now?
Yeah, so interesting. Last night the movie actually, when the captain went to see the sex worker. When I work along the Cambodian-Thai border, the province called Skattang. Actually, when we did the study there, actually they trafficking many women and children to one island that they supply sex to the fishermen that come from the boat. So the movie last night really exactly the same one that we were working. So what they do, people, and when young women and children get involved with the trafficking, very often through people that they know. They trust, like, their boyfriend and the family. They go to the village. They say, oh, please come and work in the city. We have this kind of job for you. And they entrap in the trafficking. Is that the right question you asked?
You can answer however you like. It's your question. I'm going to come back to Rod again. It's actually a question more about the filmmaking process as opposed to the central themes. You're a white Australian man telling a Cambodian story. Did you collaborate with the communities whose stories you were telling to create this film? Did you have people involved behind the scenes? Can you tell us a little bit about how you brought that together?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't look at it as me telling their story. It was like, we made the film together. you know what I mean? So I've always approached it in that way. And in terms of like, yeah, the research was one side of the filmmaking process, but then when we, did things like casting, so as part of the casting process, we got in non-speaking roles 3 guys from Myanmar to play fishermen that actually worked on the trawlers, and so we wanted them to help us inform every part of the process that fishing takes place and to make the film more authentic. And characters like Dam, like I remember Dam, and it's funny you were saying about the sex worker Mora, because Dam worked, like the captain of the trawler, who's like the main character in the story, in the film, he worked on a trawler as a kid from 11 to 13 years old, and I would always lean on him. I would be like, was it like this? Did this happen? And he's like, yeah, this would happen down the south of Thailand. This is what would be happening. It was like this. And so, every kind of part of the process of making this film was informed by real people that had experienced this world.
How close to the reality is it?
I thought it was like an extreme version of events, but it's not an extreme version at all. It's not, you can't, I mean, the film's a film. You can't get anything close to like what it's actually like for these guys. It's so horrendous and so unimaginable. Like a film, it's just really hard to, create the experiences of these guys. Like, David's story about the guy with the dog collar, and that's the first ship they've gone to, and as David says, the Gulf of Thailand is like at night, it's just like green dots, like thousands of them. If you've ever flown out of Bangkok at night and you flying to Australia, you see all the scale of it is unimaginable. And that's just one example, and the guys I talked to like all had varying experiences, but they were, it's like, torture is every day and death is every second day, like there's a murder every second day. It's pretty brutal, yeah.
I'd like to ask Vannak another question. This is about the main character in the film this time. So we watch in the film how he starts to take matters into his own hands and try to fight back. What did you think of the decision to portray that character that way, and is that something that you identify with?
គាត់សួរណាស់ថាចេះគាត់សួរថានៅក្នុងរឿងហ្នឹងឃើញនេះវាយវិញណាដល់ពេលចុងក្រោយខ្លាចពេកយើងមិនសម្លាប់ពួកអ្នកទូកវិញមើលគាត់ហ្នឹងយកមិញយល់ទេដូច្នេះគាត់សួរថាវណ្ណៈគិតយ៉ាងម៉េចដែរអាហ្នឹងណាពីព្រោះយើងមើលក្នុងឃើញគាត់ថាពេលចុងក្រោយថាយើងទាល់ខ្លាំងទៅយើងត្រូវទៅការពារខ្លួនហ្នឹងអាហ្នឹងវណ្ណៈគិតយ៉ាងម៉េច ពីព្រោះខ្ញុំដូចតែខ្ញុំមើលគាត់យប់មិញហ្នឹងវាគាត់នឹងវាមិនได้គាត់ល្អទៅគាត់ថាវាមានដូចថានៅខាងក្រៅមានខ្លះដូចថាការវាយតប់ដូចថាដើម្បីត្រឡប់មកផ្ទះវិញដើម្បីថាធ្វើបាបវាយតកែវិញសម្រាប់តកែយ៉ាងមានទូកខ្លះប៉ុន្តែគាត់ថាទូកដូចថាយប់មិញហ្នឹងវាអត់ដូចទូកខ្ញុំទេវាខុសគ្នាផ្សេងពីគ្នាអញ្ចឹងណា just there are real lie sometime when you really face the point you would fight back for survive but he said that the film last night the fishing boat last night is different from the boat that he was working on there ហើយវាការកាប់សម្លាប់នេះវាត្រូវតែមាននៅលើទូកគឺថាគ្រប់ទូកតែម្ដងគឺថាគ្រប់ទូករាប់រយរាប់ម៉ឺនពាន់ដូចថាម៉ឺនពាន់ទូកដូចថានៅកណ្ដាលសមុទ្រហ្នឹងគឺវាត្រូវការកាប់សម្លាប់គ្នាទៅវិញមកដូចរឿងកុនអញ្ចឹងប៉ុន្តែគាត់ថាដូចថាញ័រដែលឃើញទូកគាត់ដូចថានៅក្នុងនេះញ័រដែលឃើញបែរខ្លាយទូកនេះវាអូនចិត្តច្រាំងប៉ុន្តែទូកដូចថាអ្នកដូចថាសម្លាប់ធំជាងហ្នឹងខ្លាំងអានឹងវាទូកធំជាងនេះហើយគឺមានតែនដូតាយវាសបោមនុស្សសម្លាប់គ្នាទៅវិញមកហើយនដូនឿយហើយនឹងម៉លេអញ្ចឹងវាមាន3នឹង just they are killing the fishermen on the boat and because there are thousands of boats on the sea and it's also happened a lot more on the bigger boat but the film last night the boat were quite small That's why there are not many fishermen working in the boat. But in the real life, it's more violent because they involve more like a fishing man working there.
ហើយពីព្រោះទូកវាមានច្រើនណាស់ដែលវាមានទូកអ៊ុនដាំទូកអូសទូកខ្យងទូកអីចឹងវាមានគ្រប់ប្រភេទអញ្ចឹងវាមានតែហើយគ្រប់ទូកយ៉ាងដូចគ្នាវាកាប់សម្រាប់បើថាទូកយកវិញខ្ញុំអត់ដែលឃើញដូចខ្ញុំអត់ដែលជួបប្រទេសហ៎
Because there are different kind of fishing too, like they fishing different kind of fish and different kind of boat. Yeah.
I might actually use that to segue into a question for Kate, because we've just heard Rod and now Vannak just talk about the scale of the problem and the enormity of it. And you look at these oceans and they're just dotted with these boats everywhere. How in reality is it possible to get a problem like this under control, and how does that relate to legislation that we've introduced here for businesses?
Yeah, I think so. In my university capacity, I participated in that Senate inquiry into the modern slavery legislation. And there was a panel of us who were invited to speak, and there was, supply chain law, human rights professionals, and they were just asking, they were looking at us and saying, how does this happen? To them, they just couldn't conceive how there could be slaves in the supply chain of the products that they buy here in Australia. And, it's pretty, if you look at, I know we're talking about seafood, but supply chain is a supply chain, really. If you look at this dress that I'm wearing, it might say made in China, but what that really means is that it was assembled in China. So the fabric, the cotton, the dye, buttons, zips, all those sort of things are sourced from further afar. So the legislation is now forcing companies that are over a particular size to not just focus on their supplier in China or Thailand, wherever it would be, but to look at their entire supply chain as their sources of supply and to make them responsible for understanding what all those sources are. So that is actually a really monumental task. If companies, the brands themselves are having trouble getting that level of transparency, then it's even more difficult for consumers to have that understanding when they're purchasing products. And if you go to a supermarket and you look at all of the tins of tuna on the shelf, they'll all have something like responsibly sourced or dolphin friendly or something on it. But the only thing that you can really trust is something that's an independent certification. So with seafood, it's the Marine Stewardship Council, but Fair Trade or Rainforest Alliance, those types of things will certify coffee and chocolate and fresh produce. And then you can have some level of comfort that the producer of that product has had to pass an independent body to demonstrate that they've made efforts to source from an ethical sources of supply. As David was saying before, this is a really new way of thinking about a supply chain. So the clients that I work with half of the time will not even have their head around who all their suppliers are. So thinking about their suppliers and further on where the raw materials are coming from is a really new way of thinking, and we're still evolving the business models and the technology to be able to meet that. And the modern slavery legislation hasn't quite got as much teeth as we would have hoped that it would have. But what it does do is create a level playing field for all of the brands. They all have the same requirements now. Konica Minolta did this early just because David had decided to implement his values into the way that business is done, and that's the impact of an individual. What we need to do is drive systems that will push businesses into a new way of working to think about sustainability and social impact when they're doing business.
You mentioned just then that and actually this might also be a question for you, David. The legislation doesn't have as much teeth as you would have liked. What we do have, acknowledging that it is quite new, and these things always take some time to get a sense of whether they're working or not. Is there a sense that it is leading to improvements, and indeed have you witnessed any improvements in the business community?
Yeah, well, I think, as Kate said, it's still very early days. It's the first year of the legislation, and people are, wrapping their heads around it. But the angle that I take when I'm speaking to business colleagues is actually the angle I put forward at the when we gave evidence to the Senate committee that Kate also spoke to, and that is that don't see it as an impost on business. See it as an opportunity for business. And if you want to speak in real businessy terms, it's an opportunity to de-risk your business. If you've got, if the goods and services that you're consuming in your business, or possibly, your parent might be making overseas and you're reselling, are made with slave labour somewhere in the supply chain, that's illegal. That's criminal activity anywhere in the world. And so suddenly, there you are, you're a business leader, you're on a board, or you're a CEO or whatever, and you're presiding over an organisation with criminality in it. And so now the government has pointed us in the right direction to de-risk the business and get that criminality out of it. And there are amazing opportunities for, I guess, lifting who you are as a company in the eyes of your own employees and the eyes of potential customers and so on. And the story I always tell is that after I became managing director, and we'd been doing this for a while, I invited everybody in our company who'd been working for us for 25 years or more to come to Sydney for a dinner to thank them for their loyalty. And at the end of the dinner, one man stood up, very, very quiet man. He hadn't said one word all night. He said, "Could I please say something?" He stood up at the end of the table. There were about a dozen of us in a public restaurant. Everybody else turned around and looked at him. And he said, "For 25 years, I've never told anybody where I worked. I just didn't see the point. I just came to work and did a fair day's work for a fair day's pay, and that's how I fed my family." He said, "Now I tell every single person I meet that I work for Konica Minolta. And why do I do that? I do that because I feel so proud to work for an organisation that would care about young girls in Cambodia who've been trafficked into a life of sexual slavery." So we didn't know it at the time, but when we took a stance and decided to try and make a tiny difference on the other side of the world somewhere to a few people's lives, internally, we suddenly moved the dial in our company from relatively disengaged team members to engaged, and right beyond that, to loyal advocates. And I've had 50 people come up and say the same thing to me since in the lunchroom or the lift or whatever. These people now feel very proud of our company. Thank you. So that's the message I give business. It's not an impost, it's a wonderful opportunity to do something good, and you'll be rewarded for that goodness.
Mora, you come at this from a slightly different perspective. We've obviously been talking about Australian businesses and consumers. Having worked in Cambodia, you've taken an interest in policies within Southeast Asia. What can governments in those parts of the world be doing to try to crack down on these practices?
Yes, we do. Actually, the Cambodian government is working hard because a lot of research has done on trafficking. And also, I just want to say about trafficking on man and a boy in a fishing boat. I think because the reputation of trafficking the man and the boy to Thailand fishing boat is very bad, and since the world seems to know a little bit now. So actually the trend of trafficking the fishing man and boy now, they seem to move away a little bit from Thailand now. So they would start to go, the direction would go to Malaysia. Even they go to South America, and they also now start to go to Mauritius. So now the new statistic, Cambodian government work with the organization called International Organization of Migration. They're working on that. And so with Cambodia and Thailand, we have the agreement, and Cambodian government taking this very seriously because we also get a lot of support funding. We actually have the plan in the national strategy plan in Cambodia to combat all trafficking. Cambodian government also set up like a police force for trafficking. We have hotline number, and if you feel like now you're in trafficking, you can actually contact the police, like Vannak case, the Likado, the human rights organization, they advertising if you feel now you trapped, you should ring. But the problem in Cambodia, because how Cambodian people, they don't trust authority. So it's not very often they would use all these hotline telephone. Not very often the victim would run to the police to ask for this help. But I think, I hope in the future they would change the way how they don't trust the authority.
Is there other grassroots work happening on the ground to reach those communities?
Yes, like when I did the research along Cambodian Thai border regarding the women and children trafficking, so we advise to the Cambodian Women Affairs Ministry, so that we advise all the people from the village, if they want to looking for job cross border, they make sure they register with the agent that register with the government. So they should do a little bit of training. They have all the contact, and like the Cambodian embassy in the country that they are working and all that sort of thing. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I've got a question for Vannak. You're using art as a means of speaking out about human trafficking. Why is that important for you to tell your story that way? And is it a means of helping other trauma survivors as well?
Vìព្រោះជាការមួយដែលខ្ញុំចង់ធ្វើសភៅដើម្បីថាបញ្ជាក់បង្ហាញដល់មនុស្សដូចថាទូទាំងពិភពលោកដូចថាគាត់មិនបានដឹងមិនបានឮមិនបានដែលជួបប្រទះហើយក៏ដូចថាចង់ធ្វើឲ្យគាត់ដូចថាអានសភៅឲ្យគាត់យល់ពីបញ្ហាការជួញដូររបស់មនុស្សដូចជាកម្លាំងពលកម្មដែលខាងដូចថានេសាទបាទ
because it's how important is it to make the book to tell everyone the whole world actually the trafficking is real, it's happening, and it's very important. That's why he uses art and the book. It's part of the advocate people to know.
ហើយណាមួយខ្ញុំវាដូចថាខ្ញុំវាមានគំនិតដូចថាខ្ញុំវាអត់វាខ្វះដូចថាយើងកម្រិតវប្បធម៌យើងវាដូចថាវាទៀបនឹងឲ្យខ្ញុំវាអានពឹងពាក់ដូចថាខ្ញុំឆ្លាញ់តាំងពីតូចនៅខាងវិស័យសិល្បៈហ្នឹងចង់ថាខ្ញុំមានអានឹងឯការបញ្ជាក់បង្ហាញដល់មនុស្សទូទាំងពិភពលោក because the Vannak cannot read and write very much, but he's always interested. Is he like doing the picture, the painting? That's why he used that as a tool. It's a tool to tell the whole world about the trafficking.
And this is your art behind us?
Ni bom na ai nhỉ?
Yeah.
Yeah.
វាមិនខុសពីរឿងកុនយុគមិញដូចគ្នា
like the same movie last night.
ដូចគ្នា
I just have one final question before we switch over to some Q&A from the audience, and that's for Rod. In making this film, what's the message that you're hoping to communicate?
It's pretty simple. It's just how awful. Our approach to the film was to try and really engage an audience, with the desperation of wanting to leave Cambodia, with the process of being trafficked, and then being exposed to this kind of unimaginable world out on the sea. So the emotional and psychological impact of these boys and men that have been exposed to this world is devastating, and in the same way Vannak's artwork is just to bring more awareness and attention to this, issue.
Thank you. Now, is my microphone still working? It is. We've got about 10 minutes for some questions from the audience, and we've got some staff from the festival and the Wheeler Centre who have microphones if anybody wishes to ask a question of any of our panellists. So we've got 1, 2.
My question is to David. You mentioned, I think it was mentioned in the introduction, you have a connection with the United Nations. I wonder if you could just tell us a bit more about the sort of thing that we've quoted 40 million people in slavery around the world. Who's responsible for finding that out or getting those figures? And is there anything important happening within the United Nations to make this an international coordinated thing that's being done?
Yes, thanks for your question. So I'm not an absolute expert at answering this, but I'll start with the figures. So the figures come from research undertaken by the Gallup organisation. You've probably heard of them more in connection with political polling, but they are a global social research firm. And that research was funded largely by Minderoo, and specifically the Walk Free Foundation within Minderoo, which is Andrew Forrest's philanthropic arm, if you like. Andrew Forrest being the chair of Fortescue Metals, one of the wealthiest people in Australia, and he's put a lot of funding into this issue. His view as a business person when he found out about slavery was if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And so that's why he wanted that research to be done. And I think it's in its third iteration now to keep it, up to date and relevant. And it's very legitimate, robust research. Give or take, you're never going to have an exact number of measuring, criminal activities. But and as regards the United Nations role. The part of the UN that I'm attached to is the Global Compact. Global Compact Network Australia here is the local chapter. And it's our responsibility to engage business with the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of those goals. So there's not a specific focus on modern slavery, because there are 17 goals which move from alleviation of poverty to fresh water to covering many, many global issues. But goal number 8 is decent work. And then there are multiple subsections of each of the 17. And 8.7 of decent work is ending modern slavery. And I guess for myself, I'm sort of very focused down to that sort of needle point of that particular one. More so than perhaps a lot of the environmental ones and things, which are just as important in their own right. But as for kind of where does the responsibility lie, I would say it lies with all of us, it lies with every sector, and how are we going to fix this horrendous problem of 40 million people in some form of forced labour or debt bondage or child labour or forced marriage. It's going to be through very much a multi-sector approach. It won't be by us saying, well, that's government's responsibility to sort that out, or that's the UN, or that's up to academia to come up with some research that tells us what the answer is, or business are benefiting from this, so it's business's responsibility. It basically falls to all of us, and even as individual consumers. So I don't buy anything now, any item of clothing, without checking an app on my phone first. It's called Good On You. I don't have shares in the company. I have nothing to do with them commercially. It's an Australian-developed app. And I can go on there and I can just check the rating of that particular organisation before I spend any money and give them my money. And I'll walk away if the rating is low or there's zero transparency, so they can't really be rated. And so through a change of individual consumer patterns, one by one, we can all make a difference.
Do you have another?
I actually have 3 short questions. And to no one in particular. who actually owns the trawlers? Are they owned by local communities or larger corporations? Who actually does the buying and the selling of the slaves? So how does that transaction actually take place? And the third one is, very quickly, might have been answered, but is it really through the driver for all of this, through the demand from more Western cultures or more affluent societies? Is that what is driving the growth of this slavery?
Who wants to take that one?
I'll start with number 3. So, you know, I'm sure David would agree. No business leader said, "I know what would be a really good business strategy. Let's employ slaves in our supply chain to reduce cost." But unknowingly, that's what actually happened. You know, so up until about 30 years ago, things were made on shore very locally with local ingredients. We ate with the seasons. We used materials that were available locally. But then bit by bit, we globalised and offshored our production, which we very politely call to make them more efficient, which means to make them cheaper. And you know, when you look at manufacturing, the largest input cost is labour. So what we were effectively doing was moving our operations offshore. We didn't create slavery, but we utilised it. So, you know, we reduced our labour cost to you know, start producing our products offshore. So, you know, I guess it existed because of vulnerable communities in other parts of the globe. You know, and it provides a really big opportunity now. Like no advocate against slavery would say boycott brands. They would say, you know, talk to them, lobby them, and have them stay within the country and to drive change, you know, onshore. Because if all of the large brands in Australia took the approach that Konica Minolta does with their supply chains, then we'd change the world. It's just, and bit by bit that will happen. You know, I guess we'll have to see what happens with the legislation and as business systems start to change. But in terms of the sourcing of the slaves, that's probably a bit more your area, Mora. She asked about how does the actual buying and selling of people actually occur?
Because you're talking about only one like trend of trafficking, or you talk general? How can people trap into that kind of thing?
Who actually goes down and sells the slaves? Who actually is responsible for selling? So when the person on the trawler said, you know, we took this person off and we sold him, and he would be maybe on-sold by the police. Like, how is that whole buying and selling operation happen?
Okay, it's like one last night that we are watching how the boy Chatra get trapped into that because normally they have the group of the people actually in the village the same one that maybe like the film last night, the boy looking for job. So he looking for a job, so he has to have someone there in the village, their network. So the network would bring, and also they have their network that would receive. You mean like, ask that the question?
Like a broker.
Yeah, like a broker.
Like a broker. So very often, this is like also regarding to that bonding as well. Like when before the boy decide to go, often not only about the film, I talk about the real life. So the trafficker would give some money to the family. So what they do, the boy would go and work hard all the time. They never get paid because the money that they get paid would give to the trafficker. They keep taking. So you know, when you're talking about slavery, more than slavery, that word might be a little bit too strong. But For me, because I work, I never use the word slavery. I use the word like trafficking. So the trafficking, there are different kinds. They have like a small one and a big one. Sometimes the people that live the same as your village, they also take the girl work in the city and sell the girl, also the trafficking. But if you ask about the trafficking that related to like big company, slavery, selling, I don't know how to answer that actually. Do you understand what I mean? Or
When we talk about slavery, we can talk about things, like we saw on the boat, that people can be held in incarceration and physically held, but quite often the way that it occurs is through what we call debt bondage, which is what you saw in the movie, where a broker will go to a vulnerable community and say to people there, I'll pay for you to go to Thailand for a better job, and your first month's wages will pay me back. And then they get there and they end up working in a different situation to what they expected, and they don't get paid.
It's more who's actually paying the broker to get the person.
Oh, okay. So who paid and actually the broker themselves, they have all the money, their job. So actually the broker, they go to the village, they like the movie tonight. It's very real actually. I saw the movie. And so what they do, like the broker, they go to the village, they give the money to the family, maybe like $200. So the boy say, okay, now I give you $200 because we really need money urgency. So they bring the boy. So actually they sold the boy to the boatman, maybe $1,000. So the boatman use the laboring free for makes a lot of money. This is how the trafficking work. And actually I met a real situation. It real, because one time when I did the survey for the women and children trafficking, I went to one village along the Cambodian-Thai border. Like suddenly 6 boys that disappear from the village. So they just take the boy out from school, because they tell the boy, oh, you're very happy to go and work in Thailand. Very often, the people who are trapped in that kind of trafficking, they don't know. They thought they might go to work in a good environment, but in the end, they trap. When they work in the fishing boat, very often, they stay there maybe 6 months or 1 year or 2 years. Some fishermen actually pay the boy to come back. But when they come back to the shore, so the fishing boat owner would ring the police. Say, okay, they are coming now. So actually police would come and take all the money out back from the boy. Like this kind of criminal and gangster, they work together.
Do we have one more question? It is 2:30, so we've probably got time for one more. Okay.
David, can I?
Two more.
David, it's wonderful having you here, because you've got an insight from the corporate world on this issue, as well as you're so familiar with the issue itself. Are there any would you be prepared to chance your arm and sort of maybe list some companies that operate in that part of the world that we could sort of start to write to over a period of time and encourage them to take on this as an issue, as corporate social responsibility? Would you be prepared to give us some names of companies we could maybe approach who could help further on this issue? Thank you.
Now, are you thinking from the point of view of, like, if I came up with half a dozen names, which I probably can't, but because they're likely to be highly involved in the illegal practices, or because they're likely to be more receptive to doing something, or who would make it onto the list?
Who would be prepared to take it on as a way of sort of promoting, that they're also doing good work?
Yeah.
It's an issue that they care about, and that, as you said, would help them and also would help this cause. So it's more about sort of a corporate social responsibility, but being able to tell a community about where on this side. I actually, like your company, but you've been very much involved on many issue levels.
Yeah, and I might even invite other panellists if they've got names, front of mind to mention those. But look, there are some companies with enormously complex supply chains that I think are actually genuinely trying, you know, product by product to go through and try and make a difference. And, you know, Nestle is one of those. Now, there's probably a lot of slavery still in Nestle's supply chain. I think they've got something like 160,000 companies that feed into their end product range, a la what Kate was saying about the different components that go into something. But, you know, I mean, I think they're on the journey, for instance. There are some brands that are much more already associated with ethical procurement and ethical practices, like some of the outdoor clothing manufacturers like Kathmandu, for instance. So they're starting to gain prominence around their brand standing for something, not just a good quality product or whatever. But Kate or any others?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you mentioned Nestle, because when Nestle had the Kit Kat certified by UTS, which is one of the certifiers, they actually mapped 17 layers just in the Kit Kat supply chain. So you can imagine Nestle with all of the products. And last night's movie was about pet food, and Nestle's actually caught up in that because pet food is a part of their product bag. But I mean, it really is in the high risk products. Are really around. Apparel is something where they've made a lot of change just because of the Rana Plaza collapse that happened about 6 years ago, and that public dissent, you know, forced a lot of change. And before we had the legislation, it really took a disaster or naming and shaming by the likes of Greenpeace to really drive, or a CEO like David, to really drive change. But I mean, it really, as a consumer, you just need to pick a couple of your own favourite brands, and you can write to them. I mean, it's easy, and ask them, you know, where does the product come from, and ask them what they're doing about. And, you know, if everybody did that, it would really start to generate momentum. While it still stays as something that's still quite hidden and unseen, it's something that continues to be done.
I'm one of the producers of the film. I just wanted to add that we are doing a whole impact campaign around this. So we are going to have a website that actually is exactly about this, where you can connect things you can do to, you know, asking for transparency from your suppliers, signing petitions, putting pressure in terms of the economic pressure of, it's the only thing that's, well, not the only thing, but it's really the main thing that's going to shift these things, because it is, you know, it is an economic thing. So as consumers, there are things we can do. So if it's something you care about, we will have a website. At the moment, it's just, we have a Facebook page, but we will have a website which will be absolutely, we work with all these guys. We work with these organisations as well as other organisations around the world. So it'll be about connecting that information and actual direct tools that you can do something about. So, yeah, check. It'll just be called Buoyancy Film, I think, Jackie. Oh, Shania. Okay, jump on Facebook and go to our Buoyancy Film page, and then we'll keep that up to date. And then we're going to have a big website that'll just connect up a lot of this information, a lot of things you can do. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, that concludes the panel. Thank you, everybody, for coming along. Thank you to all of our panellists and to the Wheeler Centre for hosting. Just a reminder that we've got Vannak's graphic novel on sale at the back of the venue if you'd be interested in taking a look, and you can also still purchase tickets for the 2 screenings on August 12 and August 15. Thanks very much, everybody.